Hi there, my name is Aaron Pruner, and I'm a dad. I'm also one of the hosts of Dadward Spiral, a podcast that aims to answer the not-so-simple question, what the heck is fatherhood? Join me and my co-host Eddie Doty as we delve into the often sleepless, mostly misunderstood, and completely misrepresented rabbit hole of this thing called fatherhood. What's it like growing up with a dad? Or without one? And how does being a dad impact our lives? Our goal? To shine a light in the darkness and explore our culture's overall perception of dads, both the spot-on and the ridiculously off-base. So throw that rusty old grill into the lake, set the Barcalounger on fire, and come along and take a trip with us down the Dadward Spiral. Available now wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quiller Nation. We're so glad to have you listening once again to another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. We're so grateful for all of our loyal listeners, and we are excited to welcome one of our listeners to the podcast on this episode. He is a brand new member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and also an author. His name is Robert Boog. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, Robert.
That's right.
And he has written a very interesting book about the Shakespeare authorship question. It is called Shakey's Madness. Does a mental disorder reveal the real William Shakespeare? Welcome to the program, Robert.
Thanks, Stephen.
Robert, I was very intrigued when you sent me a copy of your book. I was first intrigued by the title and sort of the cartoonish illustration on the cover. And I thought, perhaps this book is really aimed at introducing young people to the Shakespeare authorship question. But as I started to read it, I realized that you did a magnificent job of sort of spanning the gap where this book can be placed in the hands, I would think, even of high school students, all the way through adults who are new to the issue or just discovering aspects of the Shakespeare authorship question, or want to know more about it. And I applaud you on creating something that is very accessible with regards to readers being able to absorb the content and digest the material. Was that part of your plan?
Oh, yes, definitely. My thought was that everyone is, especially nowadays after the 2020 pandemic, everyone's concerned about their mental health. And I read a study just in today's newspaper that said something like everyone expected all these a baby boom to occur because of the pandemic, and the opposites happened. People are more depressed right now, and more divorces have happened. And this book was kind of written during that time period, and so it kind of reflects that mood of mental health awareness, I guess.
I want to talk about some of the aspects of that as we get into the program, but I don't want to jump too far ahead. Tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you have a degree in English literature. Is that right?
Correct. I'm an English major. I know one of your staunch, or the people that you say are the hardest to convince.
Yes, well, and look at that, and here you are, one of the Oxfordian fold, because you make it very clear through this publication that you fully believe the Earl of Oxford was indeed the true writer, William Shakespeare, and you make a lot of interesting arguments. But there's a little bit of research in the book, some things that I haven't seen too often, or perhaps not at all. One of the ones I really like is the chapter on the name of the man from Stratford. And it's the fourth or fifth chapter in your book. And it's titled Guilmus Who. And it's something that I have pointed out in the past that, yes, the birth record does demonstrate that the man from Stratford was named Guilhelmus Johannes Shakespeare. But you have in your book a reproduction of the actual birth registry where there are several other people on that page who are named William. And I found it astonishing that nobody has really harped on the fact that if John Shakespeare had wanted to name his son William, he would have put it down in the birth registry as William. But no, he did not. He named him the Latin form of that, Guilhelmus, even though there were other people who had children at that same time who named their children William. How did you stumble upon that interesting bit of research and information?
Oh, I just went to the Shakespeare documented online from the Folger website. And I was on Twitter, I think it was Twitter, maybe Quora. I was having a discussion with someone who claimed that, this entire book was written in Latin and therefore you couldn't find William. And then I went to the birth record or the baptismal record. And sure enough, there is a William right above his name and right below his name, which proves, of course, that, the father, John Shakespeare or Shakespeare, could not read or he would have changed it. So he just said it to a scribe who wrote it. And so obviously he, in my mind, I don't think the guy could read.
And I love how you include in the book, and it's part of some of the unique flavor of the book that I think helps make it so accessible to readers is, you include this lyric from a David Bowie song to help illustrate your point that his real name would have been Gilly, not William, under the name of Guilhelmus.
Right, like Jim Good with Weird and Gilly and the Spiders from Mars. Yeah. Right.
I thought that's very clever. You use some very interesting contemporary references, and you inject a little bit of humor into the book, which I think is important to helping it to be accessible. I have had a lot of guests on this program, many of them who are very fantastic scholars and some who have written some fabulous scholarly books. And I feel like sometimes, though, some of our newer listeners and people who have come to this literary mystery for the first time or are just sort of dabbling with learning about it can get overwhelmed by some of the dense research and, endnotes and footnotes that can overwhelm some of the books that some of our writers have written in order to demonstrate that they are truly doing the scholarship. You have some in your book. You note where your research is coming from quite well, but I think without sort of overloading the mind of the reader who isn't quite ready for some of that full-on dense research. And I kind of feel like this is sort of a gateway drug type of a book for people who are interested in this topic. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's supposed to be fun, I think. And what I struggle with is like the length of it. I really didn't want to make it too long. I just wanted to, I was thinking in my head, I don't want to go over 140 pages. That's it. And it, that in my head is, I have the attention span of a gnat, so if I start reading an 800-page book, and I can read pretty fast, I write really fast. And that's another thing that I had a book reviewed by a Stratfordian who said I didn't do any special research. And that was his complaint. But I told him, there's no special research needed, that I'm just looking at the puzzle a different, taking a different view. And I equate it to like an optical illusion. You look at it this way, and I see the young woman, and you're looking at the old woman in the optical illusion.
Sure. There was a recent photograph that got a lot of attention and had gone viral across the digital spectrum very recently. That was a photo taken by someone in Scotland that seemed to show a oil tanker floating above the sea and flying through the sky. And they explained that it was an optical illusion based on the reflection of the sky upon the water because of the angle of the sunlight at that time of day, and that it was a very common thing. And I think that that can be used as an analogy for what has happened here with the Shakespeare authorship question. I think there are a lot of people who are actually looking at the reflection of the sky upon the water rather than seeing the ocean before them. Yeah.
Well, I think in addition to that, though, I come from the world of sales. And in selling, you need to have, some people will call it a USP, a unique selling proposition, or you need to have a reason why. I don't know if you ever heard, there was a famous experiment by Ellen Langer, the Harvard psychologist. And she did an experiment in a library where people were waiting to use a copier. And the experiment went like this. The inquisitor would say, excuse me, I need to, I was wondering if I could cut in line. I need to make some copies. And believe it or not, 63% of the people just said, yeah, go ahead. Obviously, this was not in New York City or Los Angeles. So. But when the inquisitor gave a reason why, the statistic jumped to like 93%. And so the inquisitor would say, excuse me, I have to make some copies because I'm in a hurry. And so that she wanted to dial it down just a little bit further. And the inquisitor asked, excuse me, may I cut in line because I need to make some copies. And if you think about it, what percentage of people were standing in line to make copies? 100%, right? Mm-hmm. And this person is saying, just overstating the obvious. Because I need to make copies. Well, everybody else did too. And it went to like 92%. So Ellen Langer, like the bottom line of that story is that the word because is so important to use in sales. I mean, you can sell anything, but you'll just be more successful if you give people a reason why. And I believe that the Stratfordians have this reason why, because we are encouraging inclusivity, I guess. Like someone from the low class can be a great writer. And I think that is what the Oxford movement needs to establish. And in my mind, it's more of like, because mental health is important. And everyone would agree on that. Something along those lines. We've partnered up with mental health professionals, and we believe this is important. And that takes the argument beyond just we're trying to right the wrong that happened 400 years ago. We're trying to move the ball way down and score a touchdown. You know what I mean?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that, and stealing your football analogy, it is a game of inches. And I think that sometimes a lot of Oxfordians get caught up in the idea of having to throw the long ball in order to score the instant touchdown. I think a part of that is because so many of them have devoted so much time and energy into this fight for so long. But I argue that it's a game of inches and we need to take whatever ground we can get where we can get it. And I think that we're making a lot of ground right now with younger people coming to this argument, younger people who are discovering this mystery, many of them actually finding themselves upset or angered by the fact that the halls of academia have not shared this with them, that they feel like it has, ironically, Oxfordians can be accused of being conspiracy theorists, but now you have young people who are discovering the Shakespeare authorship question and feeling like they have been the victim of a conspiracy to deprive them of this information. And that's playing in our favor quite well as, young college students and college graduates who discover this and go, wait a minute, How come no one ever told me this? How come this was hidden from me? And I think that it demonstrates to them that there's more truth to it than the standard, orthodoxy wants to believe. It demonstrates guilt in some ways on their part for trying to hide it from their students,
I agree totally. You make some very valid points there.
And I think it's one of the reasons why I was really want to dive into your book with you today, because I do think it is, as I've said before already, and I'll continue to beat this horse. It is definitely a great book for people who are a little intimidated by all of the research or the mounds of information that's available. This one really touches on some of the basic aspects of the authorship question. It touches on some of the key reasons why we believe Oxford is the guy. And then it dives into the whole mental health issue, which we'll get into in just a minute. But before we do that, I also wanted to point out, in your chapter about the Stratford Grammar School education that orthodoxy says the man from Stratford must have had, and how he learned so much there, you point out that it's quite possible that the Shakespeares didn't even live in Stratford for most of Gilmas's young life. And I'm going to start calling him Gilly Shakespeare. So you point out that there are property records that show that John Shakespeare actually leased property, 14 acres of property, quite some distance away from Stratford. Share some of the details of that, because I found that to be something fairly new that I hadn't seen and very fascinating to me, especially when you make the argument of how Gilly and Anne got together.
Yeah, it's I guess fighting fire with fire, I guess. Maybe I went to that document, Shakespeare documented at the Folger Library online. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing, what I wanted young people to do especially is to be able to go to Google and verify what I'm saying is true. Is this true or not? I mean, that way they can see for themselves. I'm not just saying this. But yeah, it says something like 2 conveyances of property or something in 1575. I don't have the book open right now, but
I do. And yeah, it does say that.
And but there is there was another author who wrote in like 1910 or something like that John Shakespeare paid £10 for a more favorable lease of Ingon Meadows, I think it was, mm-hmm. with the manor attached. And so what I found is that online, of course, if you ever get in any of these battles with Stratfordian people, they'll say, well, this was just vacant land. He did not live there. And then so I'm saying this man in 1570, I'll say 1572, just because I'm not 100%, he purchased like 5,000 tons of wool. And so he's got to store this stuff somewhere. I mean, he's buying it and then reselling it, or whatever he's doing with it. It's not like
5,600 tons of wool at an investment at the time, if you equated that to today's dollars, would be about $80,000 invested in wool.
Right. And would you just like leave that somewhere? I mean, he's going to definitely be on Johnny on the spot. I mean, people.
What would he do with all that wool?
Oh, I think he was the middleman. You know, he bought it for 12 pence and sold it for 24 pence or something like that. And that's what I think what happened to him was just the market got flooded and everything now becomes 12 pence or less. And you thought you're going to it's kind of like flipping houses. You know, you bought a house for $100,000 and you thought it was a great deal. You spent $50,000 fixing it up because you think the house is going to sell for $300,000, and then all of a sudden, all the houses are selling for $90,000. And what are you going to do with that house? You know, you've lost out on your investment. So that's kind of how I look at him.
Yeah, and you know, one of the other things you point out is that the documentation demonstrates that at some point he changes his profession title. He
Yeah,
is
and-
listed as a glover early in his life and when his son is very young. But later on in other documents, he lists himself as a yeoman, which is equitable to being a farmer. And it would make more sense to me that a farmer would live out on a farm and be dealing in wool. His son eventually becomes a big grain dealer, in fact. And so you're demonstrating that it makes far more sense for him not to have been living in town, but to have been living out on this property that we know he had a lease on, and with his 5,600 tons of wool, enlisting himself now as a farmer living in the countryside rather than a butcher / glover living in town.
Right. And what Stratfordians will say is, no, this is just vacant land. You see his brother lived out there too, and the brother took care of that land, and he had no reason to leave this highly toxic village where two of his daughters passed away at, basically within months of being born. So he would have no reason to leave that town or that hamlet or whatever they called it. So of course he had like 3 reasons to want to leave Stratford. And I believe he did. I mean, he wanted to see a son being born and being able to live till adulthood and things like that. That was more important than having him attend this school or whatever.
So he does. He loses 2 baby girls, one within 2 months of birth and one within 5 months of birth in the town of Stratford there. This is prior to the birth of Gilly. And and then he makes this move and takes the young son out of the town. And you're theorizing that it was definitely a time of plague, and that it's possible that these infants died due to disease and unsanitary conditions in Stratford. But out on the farm, you could live a lot safer. You could be self-quarantined, as it were. You could be social distancing, as it were, and stay within your own little COVID pod, as it were, right? And so I don't think it's too difficult for us, especially right now in today's world, to understand the impetus for that and why he would want to do that. But it ends up being approximately 5 miles out of town.
Right. And now you're expecting a kid a child to walk 5 miles to the school, 5 miles back, and have extra hours because he was learning this grammar all day long, and then maybe even Saturdays too. And he's living on a farm, like a 14-acre farm. Now, Steve, I've been on 14-acre farms, and everybody works. I mean, I've sold them. I've seen the people that have, that come from that type of neighborhood or whatever, but everybody works hard from, sun up to sundown. So I don't, in my mind, I don't think that it makes sense for him to be walking to school. And if he did, then he would still, the real author had such an extensive education. I mean, he learned several languages, and you can tell this just by the works that were needed to create the plays. I mean, they originated from these earlier works, many that were not even translated into English at that time. So
that's exactly right, and we point that out regularly. But what we haven't really pointed out, and you illustrate quite well in your book, and making the point right now, is we joke a lot about the Mermaid Tavern of Eternal Knowledge, where the author developed all of his knowledge of court and of falconry and of the law and a myriad list of other subjects, astronomy, alchemy. But what no one's pointed out that you're illustrating quite well is, if they did move to this farm, which it looks very much like they did, and he had to walk 5 miles into school, attend school, walk 5 miles home, do all of this extra reading of all of these source books that he miraculously could read in their native tongues of Greek, Italian, French, and Latin, and also have to help his father working on the farm. He would have required a 48-hour day in order to accomplish all of this, as well as then suddenly start writing poems and plays.
Correct. It just doesn't make sense.
It's not possible at all, right?
Right.
And so, but you also point out that by living out on this farm, he would have been within a closer distance to the woman he ends up marrying, Anne Hathaway, after he impregnates her out of wedlock and is forced into the shotgun marriage.
Right. And then interestingly, the two witnesses for his banns of marriage, because he's under the age of 21 or whatever the age of consent was, were two farmers or husbandrymen or something like that, who are working at Anne Hathaway's father's farm. And one is the executor of her estate. And they show that at Shakespeare Documented too. They have the will or something of Richard Hathaway. And I think the guy's name was Fulk Sandalus or something, was, or there's two of them, and one was the executor. So how would he know these two people and use them as witnesses? He had to be close to them, and yet John Shakespeare was signing deeds for his neighbors, and calling himself a yeoman when he's agreeing to do this. And why not use these neighbors who would be logical if he was living on or at Henley Street at that time?
Right. So now we have another connection to the farming community, the rural areas outside of Stratford, as opposed to the connection to the town. And that is that there are these farmers who are obviously associates of the Shakespeare family who serve as witnesses for the marriage.
Right. And there's even a connection, I don't know, someone else has probably mentioned this, but at that Shakespeare Documented website, you can see that John Shakespeare served as, I think he helped Richard Hathaway get out of jail, or he helped him when the daughter was 3 years old, I think. So I think there was kind of maybe an arrangement, that you help me so you can have my daughter, kind of thing. And the daughter might have, or Anne might have been getting a part of the farm or something. They, I don't know. But
there's another point that you don't make in the book, but that my brain goes to now is not only, so now let's add in another 4 or 5 hours a day that he needed in order to be introduced to Anne Hathaway, get to know her, talk his way into her bed in some form or another, ends up sleeping with her, and she ends up getting pregnant. When did he have time to seduce this older woman, or vice versa? Perhaps she seduced him, but still, when did they have time for this to all develop and happen? If he's walking to school, reading books, writing books, working on the farm, we just keep packing and packing and packing things into this man's life that can't possibly have happened all at the same time.
Yes. And what's funny, when you were saying all this, I did send my book to beta readers before publishing it, and most were young people. And the comments on the side were, "Oh, wow. Oh, my God." These little comments like that when a young person sees something like this that doesn't make sense to them, they just exclaim, "Holy crap."
Right.
And that's kind of I was just remembering that as you were going over these things.
Their reactions are very genuine and very to their generation. It's true. And right now, especially in the digital world that we live in, where everything is, social media or podcasts, or, we have so many different ways of obtaining information now, and young people are masters at it, and they're gleaning that information from everywhere. And I think it's great that you include in your book places where they can just quickly Google or do a little, Bing search or whatever their search engine happens to be, and go right to the source of what you're saying and verify for themselves that that information is there and it does exist. And I think that that's a great tactic that is starting to occur in textbooks as well. I've noticed is that they want young people to use the tools that they're used to using in order to then verify information, in order to then do further learning and use the digital realm that we have to help them do that. Unfortunately, for many of us who have giant libraries, the actual handheld book is becoming passé to the new generation who are Kindling what they're reading or website reading a lot of it. And I think it's a great advancement that you've put in your book to help guide them to those sources that they're familiar with finding and using.
Yeah, again, I'm just trying to make it a fun kind of read, but something that you can, Google verify, I guess.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you couldn't even, in the next printing of it, inject little QR codes on the page that they can actually just shoot with their phone. It will take them directly to the information or the source.
I did. You know what? I had a bunch of links in one edition, and this editor told me not to do that because she said I was getting lost in how interesting some of these places that you brought me to were. So just put it all in at the end. So that was her recommendation.
So she's like, you sent me on a rabbit hole. And then I never went back to your book.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, I could see where that could be a risk, and you got to be careful with that. That's funny. That totally makes sense. 3 months later, you're still searching through the Google. That's funny. That's really good. So let's go now deeper into madness. You point out something that I have often noticed, and people talk to me about my perspective of the works. And I think that I'm blessed with the fact that I came to the works not as a scholar, not as an English major or as a literary person, but as a theatrical person. And I was introduced to Shakespeare, of course, in school, because there were specific aspects of the canon that were required reading when I went to high school, particularly. But by that point, I was already into theater. I had already been doing theater for 5-6 years of my life because I started very young. I started at the age of 9. And so I immediately looked at these works through the lens of them being plays, not just being literature. And having throughout my career as a producer director now, producing more than 60 different Shakespearean productions and covering 24 different titles, one of the things that is difficult to stage realistically sometimes in some of these plays is the fact that characters just drop down and faint. And when you're reading it on the page, it can feel very dramatic, but when you're watching it on the stage, it can feel very contrived unless it's done correctly. One joke that theater artists always have is Othello strangles Desdemona, and then she wakes up and says, "He didn't do it." And then she dies. It's obviously it's a dramatic construct. It's there for effect. It's there to demonstrate that even in death, she is being pure. She is demonstrating her love for him. She's trying to protect him, and makes it even more tragic that he has murdered her. But there are characters who are falling down, the falling sickness, I believe it's called in Julius Caesar, when they're talking about Caesar having fainted at the dais. Cassius says he doth suffer from the falling sickness. And you have a wonderful theory as to why this author uses that so often. And you point out something that's never been illustrated to me is it is fairly unique to this writer to use this mechanism in his plays.
Yeah, I just was the guy who observed the obvious that said, why is all the fainting going on? And then I thought, oh, I'm the only one that has ever thought this, right? So I thought, noticed it like 9 times and stuff. And then I thought, you know what, I should Google this to see if somebody else has checked this out. And I came across this article by Ken Heaton, I think. And he's a medical doctor, and he did an entire study that where he researched plays from, I think it was less than 1600. So in the Renaissance, less than 1600, I guess, would be the search parameters.
So up to the beginning of the 17th century, then.
Yes.
Everything before and up to 1600.
Right. But I guess it's kind of weird because I'm not sure where exactly the medieval period differs from the Renaissance. So it kind of gets murky in my mind exactly when or how, when one starts and one ends, kind of like for those two. But anyway, so he noticed fainting by reason, I think was done by Shakespeare 10 times. And or he noticed, 18 times. But when compared to other authors of at the same time, Shakespeare did it 10 times and other authors just once. And so this got me to thinking that there must be a medical thing going on. And if so, it probably would start when you're young. When you're a child, maybe you fainted. And one of the symptoms of bipolar disorder actually is a fainting spell. Your heart goes too fast and people faint. And there's also, of course, epilepsy. So that's kind of what I thought, is that he might have been, Edward de Vere may have either had, he probably had epilepsy as a child, where there's uncontrollable shaking and people don't know really what to do, especially back then. Even now, if someone faints or if a child has an epileptic seizure, what do you do? We really don't know. And back in those days, the cure was to use mummy. And mummy is found in 3 of Shakespeare's plays. Mm-hmm. And so you get to thinking, what would be a guy from Stratford who lives 100 miles away from London doing with mummy? And of course, Stratfordians will say, well, he may have encountered it during his lost years or something like that. But to me, anyone who faints so much 18 times, you must have seen that going on. And it only, writers write what we know. And I think that to me is probably a bipolar symptom.
That's an astounding point that I think really definitely requires some more digging into by yourself and other scholars as well, to fully and better illustrate. You do a great job in your book of pointing that out and of sort of leading us down the road to the idea that the author must have suffered from some sort of illness, and that it certainly is related to these fainting spells. Excuse me. I think, if you think about it, I'm just like rushing through some of them and some of the reasons why some of the characters faint. But one of the ones that really sticks out to my mind also comes to Othello. And he goes into what is basically an epileptic fit at one point. And they comment that it's not uncommon. There are references the other characters make to the fact that this has happened before, and it occurs with him at times of great stress. And in this point, it's the stress and anxiety of believing that his wife has cheated on him, right? That she's been unfaithful. And It's interesting because many scholars, especially Oxfordians, point to Othello and they say Othello is the author. Othello is Oxford, who was convinced by an Iago type of character in his life that his wife had been untrue to him and had this terrible vexing of his soul over this. and perhaps even wanted to kill her at some point because of it. And so take that just one step further. If Othello is Oxford revealing to us that he suffers from this ailment? I know we have a lot of record. I know Oxford was very much into alchemy, and there are records of him having purchased certain medicines. Do we have any record of him ever purchasing mummy or anything like that?
I believe John Dee might have, but again, look, I'm not a researcher to be 100% honest. I'm not the greatest researcher.
Sure.
My attention span is, like I say, I think of one thing and then I think of something else, and what I'm trying to do is lead, like I'm the person holding the lantern and saying, wait, this is the cave that you have not explored, and this is where I think you'll find your answer. And that's what I try to do, is take the reader on a journey, kind of following how I thought at the time, to a conclusion that is logical and has examples, and you can check it on Google. You can look at the medical research. Even I had a psychologist or a psychiatrist actually answer me, and he said that, yes, I believe that you could make a case based on bipolar 2 affective disorder or something like that. So of course I did the opposite of what he said, like check the DSM-5 records or something. Instead, I thought, well, what if he's sending me down the wrong hole too? So I thought, what if I go back into I'm going to go down that narrow lane again and see the mansions that have the shades drawn, and see if I can open another one of these shades. And so just looking through reading through the texts and kind of like comparing it with the disorder. One of the manic episode symptoms of bipolar disorder is a thing called racing thoughts. Mm-mm. And with racing thoughts can lead to fainting spells because the heart rate increases again. They're fast-moving, fluid, and often repetitive thoughts. And so this brought me to thinking about like obsession. And that if you think about it, the real author in Romeo and Juliet, for example, kind of explains how he loves someone, like these two are like really passionate, but they're also so obsessed about that one person that nothing else matters. I mean, the family doesn't matter. Dying doesn't matter. I mean, and most of us, like at least yours truly, I would never, if I would let that person go. And in his sonnets and different things that he writes, he is so obsessed about love, and so I don't know. And I think in bipolar disorder, there's a thing called pathological love, actually. And that's something I kind of read or skimmed through, but that could be another one of these, down this different lane, because most of us in college or high school have had to write papers on Shakespeare, right? And teachers will always say, well, there are these recurring themes like mistaken identities and betrayal and love, and they'll give, write a paper about, mistaken identities in Twelfth Night or something. Mm-hmm. And we all get into doing that. But the thing is that I think that's the road that people have led us on for the last 400 years. That is not the correct road. I mean, I think the medical one is more correct, where we look at the actual symptoms and then try to correspond them to the writings and the sonnets, the texts, the poems, everything. Because
well, as you know, one of our most frequent guests here on Don't Quill the Messenger is Dr. Earl Showerman. And so I'll be interested to see what he feels about some of this. I know that's not necessarily his area of expertise, as far as like mental disorders, but we also have one of our top scholars in the organization, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, is Richard Wagaman. And I'll be very curious to see what he feels about some of this. Have you looked at some of Richard's research on the psychology of the Stratfordian myth and other aspects of that? If you haven't, I think you would be interested to see what Richard has looked into and done. I don't know if he's done anything in this particular area, but I'm certain he might want to now after you raise some of these issues. One of the things that I found very intriguing about one of the points that you make in the book is you reference what the treatment of this falling sickness, whether it's epilepsy, fainting, or bipolar, or manic depressive, you emphasize that one of the treatments is that they would lock the sufferer in a dark room and use physical violence upon them to try to break this out of them, almost like an exorcism type of thing, right?
Right.
And
it's crazy.
that occurs in the canon. It's specifically, you mentioned Twelfth Night just a moment ago with the mistaken identities, but they do that to Malvolio in Twelfth Night.
Yeah, and it's like a joke too.
Yes, and they do it to Antipholus of Syracuse in Comedy of Errors,
right?
When they believe that he's going crazy because he keeps seeing double, right? And because his twin brother is around acting differently, and so they end up throwing him into a dark room and tying him up and locking him down. So here again, we have at least two instances depicting this, but then you found some evidence that this happened to the Earl of Oxford at one point in his younger life. Explain that for us.
Well, if you look at, I can barely speak. You have such a great radio voice. I'm like hypnotized by your voice, kind of.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I think I listen to myself. I think I sound terrible. So
no, you've got that silver tone. You just your enunciation is perfect, and I'm here like listening and just admiring your speech. So he was charged like 24 pence or something for breaking the windows when he was 9 years old at Trinity College. And so I'm just the guy who notices the obvious. So I say, if the rooms were all dark, maybe you'd break them and light would come in, that kind of thing. So that's what I think Oxford did at that time, and he got charged with it. But his biographer, this Alan H. Nelson, is not a very nice person. I mean, he puts a negative spin on everything. And for example, after Oxford's wife dies, Nelson makes it seem like he's partying and having a great time and glad to be rid of that lady, kind of thing. Whereas he also could have been simply self-medicating. And by the way, I did listen to that radio episode of Dorothea
Dickerman.
Yes, where she had mentioned about going to Italy and the seeing the portraits of Venus and Adonis and the rape of Lucrece.
Yes,
and her theory kind of was that, I don't know if it was the father of Henry Riesling that raped Anne Cecil Oxford when Oxford was
actually what she said is that she believes that it was the Anne Cecil's first daughter, Elizabeth de Vere, who was the product of a rape, and
Correct.
Thus opening the door for those who convinced Edward de Vere that Anne Cecil had cheated on him, and that his daughter was not his legitimate child, and he estranges himself from mother and child for 5 years.
Right.
But before finally accepting her as his child. And that's when this whole bed trick idea of, he was tricked into having sex with his wife, and that's how he fathered the child, but didn't know that he fathered the child. And I believe that was just to save face for everybody involved at the time. And Dorothea theorizes that what happened was that Anne had been raped, and that it wasn't until later that Edward realized that that's what happened, because she, like Lucrece, kept that secret to herself out of shame,
right,
and didn't want to share with him.
Now, the question in my mind was, it Henry's father, the second Earl, who did the rape, or Henry himself? I wasn't clear on. I think we're mixing two different theories there. That's as one of my listeners in the UK hates when I say that's a whole nother story. Okay. But I think you're confusing some folks. Dorothea does have a theory as to who she believes the rapist was, but I'm not going to steal her thunder. She's doing some further research on that, and I'll bring her back on for another episode to discuss that. But Henry Roseley is of the same generation as Elizabeth de Vere. In fact, the idea was to try to marry the two of them together. Right. And so by writing Venus and Adonis, he's saying he does not want Henry to marry Elizabeth, correct?
No, by writing Venus and Adonis and the rape of Lucrece, Dorothea theorizes that Edward de Vere is telling Henry why it's okay to marry Elizabeth, that they're not actually brother and sister.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. That's where my confusion was.
Yeah.
And I guess what I thought was that if let's say that the Earl of Oxford is bipolar, and people with bipolar disorder sometimes do get, what we talked about here, these recurring thoughts, these racing thoughts, where they, it's kind of like this, that if something good happens to you, you want to repeat that good thing, and you keep thinking about that good thing, and you want to do that good thing. And then at night you can't sleep because you're thinking of that good thing. And this is kind of like what we're talking about in Othello, how he's constantly thinking about, Desdemona, and constantly thinking about her, and constantly thinking about her. And this is the thing that what I'm trying to say is that when you fit in the bipolar disorder with Edward de Vere, it kind of fits into these things too, and in meaning that if he did have bipolar disorder, he might have just believed it, kind of like the Tudor theory kind of thing. Like he might have just believed that the Queen was his mother, or that he was in love with her, or he has these thoughts that are just compulsive, and people that are close to him might realize that he is just not all the way there in terms of his emotional capacity.
I would say that even if you were to separate the Shakespeare canon and not even talk about the writings of Shakespeare and just examine the life of Edward de Vere, that there is a great argument for the fact that he could have had bipolar disorder. When you look at how his life played out, and you look at what we know and the documents and the letters and the waves of manic moments and depression, I think it's very evident that you are onto something, that this guy definitely suffered from something, and that was then exacerbated by the circumstances of his life, including losing his father at a young age, his mother quickly marrying another man, being separated from his family and being sent into basically foster care under the Cecil family as a ward of the court. The loss of certain mentors and tutors in his life that he grew an attachment to, his very tumultuous love affairs with the women in his life, including and Vavasour, who I think he was desperately, desperately in love with at some point in his life, and then learned later that she wasn't the bright, shining angel that he thought she was, and felt so horribly betrayed by her. The feeling of betrayal that he felt with regards to his wife, Anne, and then the realization that it wasn't a betrayal at all. I think, yeah, if you just look at his life story, there's definitely a great case to be made here that the man suffered from some sort of struggle.
I'm in agreement. And what is interesting too is that nowadays bipolar disorder has become more popular. In fact, there's a TV show called Homeland. I don't know if you've seen that, where
I know of it.
Yeah, Claire Danes is this gritty FBI agent, and she has bipolar disorder. And so I remember reading something where she said that she just went on YouTube and listened to people with bipolar disorder, and just from them she realized that, just like you say, they're active kind of people. They change religions often, sexual partners more often, hairstyles more often. They read more books, they curse more, and their clothing is more extravagant, just to give you a few things of what she said. And those things
all of those
fit.
things fit. They all fit. Yes, they all absolutely fit Edward de Vere. You point out in your book that he once purchased how many pairs of shoes all at once?
Yeah, it's like over 40 pairs of shoes, I think.
So it can be argued that, and this is definitely, I know this for a fact, I know a little bit about bipolar disorder, and you're right. I don't know if I would use the term it's become more popular, but I would say it's become, our level of awareness has definitely increased about this disorder and how it affects people. And you're right, it has become more of a mainstream choice for certain characters in films and television shows. There was a sitcom, I believe, is called Real Family, where the father in the series suffered from a similar type of disorder, and they make it very prevalent part of the storyline of that series, I believe. And his good days and his bad days, but you're right. And one of the huge ones is shopping, spending excessively, and too many of the same thing. And here we have these records of the Earl of Oxford lavishly spending, especially on clothes. And in the instance you point out, like, far more pairs of shoes than any person could ever want or need or possibly wear, unless he was wearing, like a different pair every day for months. So yeah, I think, and what we've learned is that people who do that, they're doing that as a form of, as you mentioned earlier, the term self-medicating, and it makes them feel better, right? They go shop, and it makes them feel better about themselves, and it's filling some sort of gap inside, right?
Exactly. And so does writing.
And that's the next one I want to get to. But I want to point out, Dr. Roger Strittmatter is known for commonly saying that the Earl of Oxford was the most downwardly mobile earl in the history of the Elizabethan court. And a big part of that was because of these manic moments, these lavish spending moments, this frivolity, excessive celebration. And then you contrast that with some of the letters that he would write to the Queen or to William Cecil, where you can get this sense of deep melancholy, the melancholy Jacques of As You Like It. Is a great example of somebody who is obviously suffering from this same type of malady. And look what we see. Look what Jacques does. He goes off to live a monastic life at the end of the play. And what happens to Edward de Vere later in life? He goes almost basically into seclusion.
Yeah, some people actually believe that he faked his own death, kind of thing.
And some people believe that he caused his own death, kind of thing, and that scandal was difficult to avoid and keep in the shadows. Here is a man that, if we're right, if he is the author of these plays, who writes one of the greatest, if not the most popularly known soliloquy of all time, To Be or Not to Be, where he is, without a doubt, contemplating his own death, suicide.
Correct. And also, not to steal your thunder, there is a connection between bipolar disorder and stroke. So there is, if you just Google that, you'll see that there are some relations there. So, or relationships. But there's kind of like three theories there. I would go with yours that he probably, it's very logical. And to me, it makes the most sense. But when you talk about bipolar disorder with people that have bipolar disorder, you really don't want to mention Kurt Cobain kind of thing. You want to mention someone more upbeat or that did not commit suicide. And that's kind of the challenge in that. But I think it's important to address that we currently have like the silent epidemic of people that endure this terrible mood disorder. And what I think would take the Oxford cause further would be to say, look, I understand how you feel about it. Here's the thing from sales. I don't know if you've ever heard of feel, felt, found before.
No, I'm not certain I have.
Okay. Well, there's three words: feel, felt, and found. So whenever, in real estate, when someone raises an objection, like this kitchen's too small, you say something like, I understand how you feel, Mrs. Jones, this kitchen is too small. And many people have felt the same way. You've used felt. Mm-hmm. But what we found is that it's more convenient these days when you have a microwave on this side, and that's how you sell people, kind of.
Yeah, we didn't mention anywhere in the program that you make your living today as a real estate salesman, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I've done it for many years. And that's the thing. When you're selling, I come from the world of sales, and when you're selling like this, idea that we want the whole world to know that, yes, this man was flawed. He had a thing that's called bipolar disorder, and maybe you've heard of it. But if you haven't, it takes, the symptoms start arising at the time when students start learning about Shakespeare. And by the way, what we found is that the real Shakespeare had bipolar disorder. Let me show you here. And that kind of thing,
Sure. And one of the things before we run out of time, and I definitely want to touch on, there's two things I want to touch on. The first one is you mentioned previously just a bit ago about writing also being a form of self-medication. And I want to hear more from you a little bit on that, because you also reference another writer, a modern writer, who suffered from bipolar disorder and who explained that writing was one of his therapies. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, the writer that I'm referring to is Kurt Vonnegut, who passed away in 2007. And he actually said that writing was his therapy. It cured his bipolar issues, meaning that get up in the morning and start to write. And because in the 1570s or 1590s, people didn't know anything about bipolar disorder, and that's, to me, it's kind of like also that is the the bloody sword or the smoking gun. Mm-hmm. That if this man has it, it's only 2% of the population has this disorder, and Sir Francis Bacon certainly didn't have it, or the man from Stratford didn't have it. If we can see in the text and the sonnets of depression and these feelings of recurring thoughts, or these what I call racing thoughts, and these other symptoms, then it seems like this is the person who wrote. And we should embrace him and applaud him for showing us that even if you're a student today, why don't you write down your thoughts? That may just help you live a longer life.
And it's not uncommon that great genius suffer these types of maladies as well. And certainly, certainly we have a lot of references of writers, great writers who suffer.
Yes.
Look at Poe, for instance.
Sure.
There's a horrible story of a man who was tortured throughout his life and wrote in order to ease that pain. Obviously there are, others. If you look at Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, feverishly writing music, but going from manic to depressed throughout his life, and end up dying in early life because of lavish spending and obsessive compulsive behavior. Right. The other one that comes to mind immediately now is Hemingway, and we all know how he ended. But look at these great works of literature we have from him prior to him ending his own life. So I think that, there are also anecdotal references that we can make here that we can demonstrate and go, yeah, these things all tend to connect together and make far more sense when you're looking at this man's life and what he did with his life and how it's reflected in these works. And this is just another layer. As you said, 10 times more often he writes about someone fainting than any other writer of the time.
And that's what I would encourage your listeners to look through the sonnets, look through the poetry, look through the plays, and see if you can find those instances of possible bipolar disorder symptoms. And by doing that,
go ahead.
It just makes the case stronger.
Yeah, and one of the final notes that I wanted to touch on, and it's something else that I really was so pleased to see in your book, is that you then, near the end of the book, address this, and you address that this is an awareness issue. You address that it is a problem and a growing problem with our young people, and you give resources and references that people can go to find out more information and help them deal with someone in their own family or circle who maybe suffers from this, or to identify this disorder in themselves or in someone that is a loved one. And I really loved the fact that you went that way and that you included that in the book and made sure that if this book does find its way into the hands of a high school student or a college student, and they're reading this and they're becoming more intrigued, and as they're going through the book they're realizing that there are similarities here in their own behavior, or that they start to self-identify with this character, this person, this writer, these plays, and this 17th Earl of Oxford, and they discover that they need to reach out. You provide them some resources there on how they can do that. And I think that was an awesome addition to the end of the book.
Oh, thank you. And also instructors too, because especially in these days of Zoom and, these hybrid classes, I think we're going to find that there are a lot of instructors that may be feeling more depressed and more under the gun kind of thing. They're losing tenure, or there's not enough money, whatever the case. But to hang in there and look at the works as inspiration, and just say, can you imagine, this guy was the world's greatest writer and he endured this insidious mood disorder that we still haven't figured out today. And that's the interesting thing, is that one person said, well, isn't this all just speculation? And I said, well, speculation is when there is no known, it's not like there is a test that you can take for someone's brain. I mean, it's not like a broken leg that you can look up and see under an X-ray. A mood disorder is identified by self-reporting, the reporting of witnesses, and seeing a psychiatrist. That's how people are diagnosed today in 2021 with having bipolar disorder. It's not like, it's not like you have COVID and they do a test and yes, this guy's got it.
They don't stick a swab up your nose and say you have
No.
you have bipolar disorder.
No. And so that's the thing. If we can match the symptoms from the works to this gentleman of the Earl of Oxford, then we can, I think, that really push it forward more by embracing this disorder and saying what we want to do is, how can we help you, or how can we push this out to more people so that they understand that it's not just about righting a wrong that was done to this guy, but also helping people that currently have this disorder today. And like the medicine Latuda that kind of started this whole thing, that Latuda costs like $1,500 for a 1 month supply. I mean, there's got to be a way to make that cheaper so
And
that people can enjoy.
I'm sure in the Earl of Oxford's time, finding powdered mummy was not a very easy or cheap thing to do either.
Exactly. No. And, I think, I kind of wonder, I read somewhere that, lithium is made from a salt, and that's what is currently used for some bipolar people.
Well, right, and you point out in your book that the reason that people are like, ooh, ground up powdered mummy, what kind of a medicine was that? Well, it had a really sulfuric stench to it.
Right.
And so what they would often do, right, is they would dip like a handkerchief or something in it. And then when they were having one of these fits or felt like they were about to come upon them, they would place it under their nose and use it as sort of like a smelling salt in order to shock the brain and to, prevent the onset of an epileptic seizure or to awaken someone after a fainting spell.
Yes. And of course, Shakespeare uses it as like a plot device. The reason that Desdemona doesn't just fetch another white handkerchief is because the mummy turns the handkerchief red, and plus it would smell. There's a someone says, "Oh, my nose," like right around that. I don't have the exact quote in my brain, but if you look it up, where they use it, they make some response to the smell right then when they use it.
And Othello says very specifically that handkerchief was to my mother by an Egyptian given.
Yes, and Egyptian is where the mummy comes from.
Of course. And so you can imagine, here's a young man. So he's had it for how long? Because why did the Egyptian give it to his mother? So that his mother could use it to help her son's ailment.
Yes. You said it.
Yeah, well, I think you're on something.
That's a drop the mic moment right there.
There you go. Well, thank you, Robert. It's been a fascinating conversation. And I do want to remind everybody who's listening, the book is called Shakey's Madness. Does a Mental Disorder Reveal the Real William Shakespeare? It is an ebook and it is in paperback version as well. You can find it where, Robert?
You can find it on my website, www.robertboog.com, or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the major
all your major
online
booksellers, and it is available through there is a entry at Goodreads, and so you can read it there, and you can read some of the reviews of it there, including my own review of it there. And you can also place your own review after you've had the book and read the book. It's a very quick and easy read. As Robert mentioned, he kept it under 150 pages. And it's very enjoyable. It's laced with some fun little humor and some contemporary references, but it also points out some very intriguing details and really dives into some areas that I think need some further exploration. As you said, you are the lantern pointing to caves that are yet to be explored. And I'm hoping that you have inspired some spelunkers to dive in and seek some answers down those holes.
Thank you. I do hope that your listeners pick up the ball and take it as far as they possibly can.
Before we sign off, I will remind everybody that Don't Quill the Messenger is sponsored by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. You too can become a new member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, like our friend here, Robert Boog, who is a recent member who has joined. And won't you please consider doing so? It was an easy process, wasn't it, Robert?
Yep, very easy.
Simple process online. He is now a member. He now has access to our quarterly newsletters as well as special offers and other information that comes out on a regular period, including our upcoming symposiums and other presentations and outreach efforts that the organization supports. So please consider joining Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. You can do it online at the website. And as always, my fellow Quillers, I want to remind you, say it with me now, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.